Digital Performer is a very interesting digital audio workstation. First of all, it was one of the first DAWs, and then it was also one of the first DAWs that allowed you to use surround sound. And because of that, it remains popular among film and TV composers until this day. Now, you would think that because of that, it is also a DAW that really lends itself towards Dolby Atmos, but you could not be more wrong. As it turns out, Digital Performer is also a digital audio workstation that really resists Dolby Atmos. It's not that easy to use Dolby Atmos within the context of Digital Performer, so I felt it is time to create a video about it. Today I'm going to show you how to use Dolby Atmos in Digital Performer version 11. And I decided to split this video into two parts. In the first part, which is this video, we're going to talk about the basic setup. And in the second part of this video, which I'm going to publish next week, I'm going to talk about some specialties that can be done within the Digital Performer. Digital Performer has this very interesting track layout of a 10.2 track. And as it turns out, that is very similar to a 7.1.2 bed track in Dolby Atmos. And we're going to do a little bit of magic in order to convert 10.2 into 7.1.2, but that's coming next week. This week, we're going to talk about how to set up Dolby Atmos in Digital Performer version 11. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I'm a digital media educator with more than 30 years of experience in higher education. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. Today about how to create Dolby Atmos with Digital Performer. If any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join our Discord community. Invite link is in the description below, or there's also a QR code here somewhere. And you can now also follow me on Instagram, social links below. Before I get started, I need to make two disclaimers. First of all, I'm not a regular user of Digital Performer, so it is very well possible that there are certain shortcuts that I'm not aware of. If you see me do anything that you think could be done quicker, let me know in the comment section. I really like to learn about how to use Digital Performer because I think this is a really fascinating digital audio workstation. The second thing is that I'm working with Digital Performer 11, and this is relevant because for everything that I said before, my feeling is that the people behind Digital Performer are currently in the process of implementing a Dolby Atmos workflow internal to Digital Performer because that is the obvious thing to do. So it is very well possible that in one of the future versions of Digital Performer, everything that I'm going to talk about today becomes obsolete because it has an internal workflow. So if you're working in a Digital Performer version 13, 14, 15, and you have an internal Dolby Atmos workflow and you're kind of thinking to yourself, what is this guy talking about? It is essentially because I'm working with version 11. So let's hop into our Digital Performer project. Now the loops that I'm going to use today are loops that I've used before. They come with the elastic player from Überschall with the demo bank. I like to use them because of their very flexible licensing agreements. I never get copyright strikes if I use them. I'm going to leave a link in the description in case you're interested where to get those loops. But essentially for our purposes, this is just a very, very simple setup. So let's have a listen what we have here. So essentially it consists of a pad. So let me just kind of deselect those for a second. So there's a pad here. And we're going to use this pad in order to create a Dolby Atmos bed. So this is going to be the bedding of our Dolby Atmos project. Then we have a synth. And then we have a key loop and a bass loop. And these three loops are going to become our objects. So we're going to have 3 stereo objects, so 6 objects in total. Now I'm working with a Mac today, and the reason for that is very simple, that I want to set up the project with the Dolby Atmos Renderer, and the Dolby Atmos Renderer only exists on a Mac. If you are on Windows, one way you could go is with the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer that can also work on Windows. The way this works is very similar to any of the other digital audio workstations. So if you're interested in that, I leave a couple of links in the description below where you can see how we set that up in Bitwig and FL Studio, and you would essentially have to do the same thing in Digital Performer, and that actually works equally well. But here I'm going to work with the Dolby Atmos Renderer, so I'm going to follow the official Dolby Atmos workflow. So the first thing I need to do is I need to open up the Dolby Atmos Renderer. So let's go into the Dolby folder, and here we have the Dolby Atmos Renderer. And it's opening up. So the next thing I need to do is I need to make sure that the audio is no longer routed from the Digital Performer into my output, but instead kind of routed through the Dolby Atmos Renderer. In order to do that, we need to set up the Dolby Atmos bridge or the Dolby Audio bridge. There are two kind of places where we need to do that. First of all, within the Dolby Atmos Renderer. So let's just first go into the preferences of the Dolby Atmos Renderer. And we need to select as the input device the Dolby Audio Bridge. And the output device is whatever your regular output is. In my particular case, I'm sending it through the roadcaster so that you can actually hear something. We also take note of the frame rate because we need to change that in Digital Performer. That essentially is everything for the Dolby Atmos Renderer for the moment. Then you need to go into Digital Performer and we need to set up the audio interface in Digital Performer. So we go into Setup, and in Setup we go into Configure Audio System, and we're going to configure the hardware driver. And in the hardware driver, we're going to select the Dolby Audio Bridge. Here is the Dolby Audio Bridge. We also need to make sure that sample rate is okay. Dolby requires a sample rate of 48 kilohertz and a buffer size of 512, but that has set up everything correctly. So let's press OK here. One final thing that we're going to do, we took note that the Dolby Atmos Renderer expects a frame rate of 4 frames per second. Digital Performer currently set to 30 frames per second, so let's just switch that over to 24 frames per second in order to make sure that everything is running the way it's supposed to run. And once we have done that, we should already hear audio through the Dolby Atmos Renderer. So let me just play the audio again. So now essentially it's running through the Dolby Atmos Renderer, through the two outputs, into the bed of the Dolby Atmos setup, really. Now, this is not particularly interesting right now. So what we really want is we want to, first of all, have a little bit more of a immersive bed. So we want to take advantage of the capabilities of Digital Performer to work with surround sound in order to create a surround sound bed. And then we want to send the 3 tracks or the 3 object tracks that we have here into the objects of the Dolby Atmos Renderer. So let's start with the Dolby Atmos bed. And in order to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the output settings. And in order to do that in the Digital Performer, I go into Studio, into the Bundles section here. And under Bundles, let me just kind of bring that window over here. I'm going to go into outputs. Currently it's set to a stereo output, but we actually have more channels available to us now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch that over to a 5.1 output. My feeling is that most people who are working with Digital Performer are probably kind of working with 5.1. That's sort of almost the standard for many TV and film applications. However, there are other options that you have here. And one thing that I found particularly interesting is the option of a 10.2 output. Now, it turns out that we can actually use 10.2 in order to create a 7.1.2 bed for Dolby Atmos, but that kind of requires a little bit of kind of workaround, a little bit of a hack. So I'm going to kind of do that in a separate video, which I'm going to talk about next week. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of switch it over to 5.1. So I now have a 5.1 output. So the next thing is, and this is not technically not really necessary, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an additional bus that is going to serve as our bed bus. Now this once again would not be really necessary. You could simply send the audio into the Dolby Atmos bed, into the output, into the 5.1 output. But in order to kind of, for purposes of kind of having everything neat and tidy, let's add an additional bus here. So we're going to add a bus, and let's call that bus Atmos bed, and let's make that a 5.1 bed. And that essentially for the moment completes our bundle setup. So the next thing I'm going to do, and that is also not really necessary, is I'm going to add an aux track that is going to serve as our track that sends the audio into the Dolby Atmos bed. So let's just add a aux track here. And in this aux track, the input is going to come from the Dolby Atmos bed bus. And then essentially the output is going to be the main out. Let's just rename that into Atmos bed. And then what we're going to do is we're going to send the pad into the bus, into the Dolby Atmos bed bus. And that should now essentially send the audio from the pad into the Atmos bed bus. And here we have sort of this aux track that essentially forwards it then to the Dolby Atmos renderer through the main output. So let's just maybe kind of turn off the 3 tracks that we don't need here. And let's just kind of see if we're actually getting audio. And indeed we do. So let's go into a mixing board. That essentially now means that we can move that essentially around. So let's just kind of make that a little bit more immersive, and that should now kind of give us a little bit of a spread. Kind of we are using 5.1, which essentially means we have left, right, and the two surround speakers here. And, kind of we can go into the settings of the panner, and we can, for example, change the what's going into the center a little. So let's just add a little bit center information. And that kind of adds a little bit into the center, and you can play around with those things. Now, before I continue, let me just organize things a little. So let's just turn it off maybe. Let's just organize things a little. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that up here, and let's maybe give that a color. I don't know, blue. So we already have the bed that is forwarded into the Dolby Atmos Renderer. We have already kind of created a surround bed. We are stuck with 5.1. That's sort of the standard that most people use with Digital Performer. The next thing we need to do is we need to send the three tracks that we have, the synth track, the keys track, and the bass track into our Dolby Atmos objects. And there are a couple of things that we need to do before we can continue. First of all, we once again need to go into the studio settings under bundles, and we need to create additional outputs. So we're going to add three outputs for that for those three stereo objects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send them into the tracks that are going to reach the Dolby Atmos Renderer as objects, so kind of starting at object track number 11. Now, for reasons that will become a little bit more obvious next week, I'm going to start numbering at 13 because I need the first 12 channels to be essentially kind of reserved for the 10.2 track that we're going to use as in lieu of a 7.1.2 bed track next week. So I'm going to start with the numbering at track number 13. So the first of those outputs is going to go through 13 and 14. So let me just kind of move that over here. Then we have 15 and 16 and 17 and 18. And I'm going to leave the names here alone because that is essentially just fine. And then all we need to do is we need to send this to those outputs. So let's just send that the first one to 13, 14, the second one to 15, 16, and the third one to 17, 18. Let's just enable those tracks again. And if we now play everything, the renderer will already receive the audio, but we're not going to hear them. So let's just kind of see what is happening then. So as we can see, sort of the audio is already reaching the tracks 13, 14, 15, 16. And once we kind of go back to the bass, we also have 17, 18, but we don't hear the audio yet. And the reason for that is because the renderer does not yet receive any panning information. So the renderer doesn't really know how to render those audio tracks because it doesn't know where they really are. So there's no three-dimensional information. So now in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to add the Dolby Atmos Music Panner plugin to our tracks. So let's do that. So we are with the synth, the keys, and the bass. So let's add the Panner plugin. Let's search for music, Dolby Atmos Music Panner. And then essentially all we really need to do is we need to select the object pair. We have the synth. The synth, if you remember, kind of went into tracks number 13 and 14. So we need to select the object pair 13 and 14 here. And then we just make sure that there's a green dot here that essentially means that the panner has recognized that there is a Dolby Atmos renderer in the system. And we'll just leave everything alone for the moment, and then let's just see if we are getting the synth. So yes, we are getting the synth. The blue circles around these dots indicate that the Dolby Atmos renderer is now receiving the panning information. Now, at the moment, we don't really have any timecode information yet. That's going to come a little bit later. But before we do that, let's first add the panning information to the two other tracks that we have. So let's add another music panner to the second object. Select, and here we have object pair number 15 and 16. And then the third one, Dolby Atmos Music Panner. And here we have 17 and 18. And let's just double check if they're actually receiving campaigning information. And yes, coming through. So the last thing we need to do is we need to send the timecode information to the Dolby Atmos Renderer. And this is actually a little bit tricky with Digital Performer. As it turns out, the timecode plugin that is provided with Dolby Atmos is not recognized by the Digital Performer, at least not in my setup. Your mileage might vary, but in my case, this was not really the case. Fortunately, there are quite useful workarounds, and I'm going to actually show you 3 different ways on how you can work around that issue. But let me first kind of talk about a little bit about what is happening here. Well, first of all, there are a couple of things that we need. The first thing that we need is we need a separate output that sends the timecode information into the Dolby Atmos Renderer, and that has to go out on channel 129. So we're going to go into the studio settings, and in the studio settings, once again in the bundles, we're going to create an additional mono output. So let's just switch that over to mono. And this mono output, let's give that a name. Let's call that LTC, is going to go out on track on channel 129. So we have to scroll over here until we reach 129. So we're going to select that. So that is now kind of leaving the Digital Performer on channel 129 and is essentially entering the Dolby Atmos Renderer at channel 129. And the renderer expects the timecode information on that particular channel. Now, what we would have to do is we would have to add a track that would sort of hold the LTC plugin. Now, the LTC plugin is a generator plugin, so it should actually technically in Digital Performer appear as an instrument. But as you can see, essentially no Dolby here, so essentially it does not really recognize that. Now, once again, this might be different on your system. I tried a lot of different things. I could not get the LTC plugin to show up. But kind of if you are in the fortunate situation that in your system as the LTC plugin actually shows up as a plugin, simply select it and you're good to go. But here I actually need to do a little bit of a workaround. So after setting up the output, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a track that sends into that output. So let me just add another mono audio track. And that mono audio track, we actually don't need any input here, is going to send out on the LTC output. Let's maybe rename that, and let's rename that to LTC so that we understand what is actually happening here. And then what we need to do is we need to go into the mixer, mixing board, and we would technically have to add the LTC plugin, but once again, that doesn't show up. So if you search for LTC, I don't really see anything. But what we can do is we can wrap the LTC plugin into a plugin wrapper. So if you have a Plogue Bidule, for example, we can open up Plogue Bidule, and that will essentially open up. And instead of loading the LTC plugin into the slot, into the insert in Digital Performer, what we can do is we can simply load it here into Plogue Bidule. So let me just delete the mixer here. And then essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a audio unit generator. Here we have the Dolby LTC generator, 0 in, 1 out. We only have the mono version here, and all I really need to do is need to select that. There's one additional thing that I need to do, and that is I need to go into the settings of that plugin within Bidule, and I need to select the sync source, and the sync source should be Plogue Bidule. So that the plugin essentially takes out, essentially receives the sync information from Plogue Bidule and passes it on to our output. And this should already work. So let's just see if we are getting timecode information. So let's just close that and maybe go back here so that we get some sense of what's actually happening. And as you can see, I now received the time information and everything should actually work okay. At that point, you are really set to go. However, Plogue Bidule is a little bit more expensive, so I'm going to show you 2 additional options that you might have that are a little less expensive but work equally well. And for that, let me just delete that track again. So let's just delete the track. And what I'm going to do now, instead of using Plogue Bidule, I'm going to use a different timecode plugin, because technically it doesn't really matter what timecode plugin you use. You could use any timecode plugin that is available to you, kind of, especially for people that are working with Cubase, for example. Cubase has an integrated timecode plugin. Unfortunately, Digital Performer doesn't have such a timecode plugin. However, there are timecode plugins that you can purchase. And one of those timecode plugins is called TXL20, and I'm going to post a link in the description below, and we can use that instead of the LTC plugin from Dolby. So let's do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a track, and this time we're going to add an instrument track. And in the instrument, we're going to go down to TXL20. That is sort of the timecode plugin, and we're going to select that. And then we're going to turn off the recording because we don't need that. And let's just make sure that we're also sending the output into the LTC output. And then we need to enable SMPTE in order for that to actually kind of send out the correct timecode information. And if we start the track now, essentially we see the timecode is generated by this plugin. And it is also kind of reaching the Dolby Atmos Renderer. So this is another option that you have. This plugin is not particularly expensive. I think it costs like $20, so it is fairly inexpensive and easy to use. It has, however, one issue in the context of Digital Performer, and that is sort of if I'm not kind of playing anything, you can see that this is sort of has this hectic behavior. And because of that, I'm going to show you a third option, and this third option is completely free. And what we can do is, instead of using a plugin, we can actually pre-render the timecode and use an audio file instead, and that can be done with a free service that is web-based. So let me first delete what I've done here. So I'm going to delete that track again for the second time. And instead of kind of using a plugin, I'm now going to use a regular mono audio track, and no input. And then essentially, once again, the output is going to be LTC. And I might also kind of go into the sequence. And let me just rename that again. Let's call that LTC here. So what I can do is I can go to a website, and I'm going to post a link in the description below. And this website is called LTC2, and that allows us to generate an audio file that can serve as a timecode generator. So what we have to do is we have to select the parameters that we want. Once again, we have a 24 frame rate per second file. We have a sample rate of 48 kilohertz. We are at 24-bit. We can double check that. So we have 24-bit here. And this is actually one of the things that you need to be aware of. If you kind of started to generate it that way, it will actually not work, even though the start time is consistent with the start time of the digital performer. If you actually kind of do it that way, it will actually get confused. What you have to do is we actually have to change that back to 0. So we need to set it to 0, otherwise it won't work. And then we can generate the LTC. And that will now generate the audio file. We can select the time of the length of that file. I've chosen 10 minutes. That should be long enough. And then we essentially download that. And let me just download that to the desktop. And I don't think I need that anymore. And then what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to drop that audio file into Digital Performer. Now the file came as a zip file. Let me just kind of put it here and just open that up. So here we have that audio file, and I'm going to drop that into Digital Performer here, and that will now kind of generate the timecode for me. So instead of using a plugin, I'm simply using the audio pre-rendered. And with that, it should actually also work just fine. So let me just play that again. And as you can see, it is now kind of receiving the timecode exactly. And I'm not going to get that wiggling kind of thing going on. So essentially, it does exactly the way it's supposed to kind of work, and that essentially works perfectly fine. And at that point, all you really need to do is you need to kind of move objects around. So let me just kind of maybe do that a little. So let's go into a mixing board and let's open up the 3 plugins. Let's maybe play the audio. So let's just kind of move those maybe up a little. And let's kind of change the size somewhat. Let's do the same thing for the other. Let's just move that back just a little bit, maybe a little closer. And then the third one. And I'm just going to move that in a bit. And if I now go to the Dolby Atmos Renderer, I essentially see these objects here in their respective locations, and everything works fine. So at this point, essentially, if you're happy, you just use the renderer in order to record the Dolby Atmos and save that as a Dolby Atmos master file, and then you can submit it to a streaming service for distribution as a spatial audio file. Now, this is really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching. Once again, I'm going to continue this project next week when we are going to look into how to use actually a 10.2 track, which is a very unique kind of track layout that only exists in Digital Performer, at least to my understanding. And that's going to be really interesting. It's going to be a little bit of a hack. So if you're interested in that, watch out for next week's video. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join our Discord community. Once again, link in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video next week.